First of all, has it surprised you, perhaps, the difference that we've started to see here? People being less supportive of the RMT and the train strikes, but incredibly supportive of the nurses, for example, the paramedics and everyone else within the NHS.
No, I don't think we should be surprised about this. In essence, what you see in this polling of different groups is, in a sense, a reflection of what we might want to call the perceived social value of the occupations. At the end of the day, we think that nurses do a very good job, a very important job. We are therefore sympathetic to them. We're less inclined to take that view about postal workers and of those who are running our trains. And one group that's certainly which is also on strike, getting much less publicity, but is certainly not getting much public support, are the driving examiners. So the truth is, nobody likes a driving examiner unless they say you've passed. So the truth is, I don't think we should be surprised about this. And it does therefore suggest that insofar as the government wants to hold a firm line, probably trying to hold a firm line against the nurses and the ambulance workers is politically the most difficult bit for it to do. Whereas standing up to the postal workers and the train strikers, if you want to put it in those terms, is probably something politically that's much easier for the government to do. Not least of the reasons is that one of the ways in which I think the nurses and the ambulance workers have perhaps quite savvily pursued their case is to try to link their case to broader public concern about the state of the public services, in particularly the health service. I think one of the risks that the government faces, at least, is that if indeed these strikes go on, that this will become part of a wider narrative whereby people blame the government for the state of the health service, about which we know there's a great deal of dissatisfaction. So the government, I think, does have to play its hand quite carefully. That said, I think it's also true that even the nurses and the ambulance drivers have to be careful not to overplay their hand. Although some of the polling at the weekend suggested that support for their actions was holding up, that was particularly with reference to the strikes that are taking place before Christmas. Other polling from Ipsos suggested even for the nurses and for the ambulance workers, support, although still relatively high, has gone down during the course of the autumn, and that certainly the public don't necessarily endorse the idea of a 19% pay rise, which has now got so much headline publicity in the case of the nurses. So I think it's also true that the unions do now need to think quite carefully about how they play their hand.
And yet, if we look into how this flows into the wider perception of political parties, we saw the most extraordinary MRP poll last week from Savanta, which found that the Conservatives, on their numbers, would crash down to just 69 seats, down from 365 at the last election to 69 in their MRP projection. It's the most remarkable picture. John Curtis, do you believe it?
Well, let's at least give you an explanation as to why you might get something like those kinds of numbers, if not necessarily those exact numbers. The truth is, of course, that poll, like most other polls at the moment, still suggests that the Conservatives are around 20 points down behind Labour in the polls, and that they are something like 16, 17 points adrift of where they were back in 2019. Now, if a party's support's going down that much, it's not possible for its support to be going down by 16 or 17 points everywhere, because there are quite a lot of constituencies where there isn't 16 or 17% of the vote left for the Conservatives to fall. And that therefore, although at the moment when we look at a 20-point lead on the conventional calculation, we say, well, the Conservatives will certainly lose badly, markedly less than 200 seats, but maybe Labour not much more than 350, 360. Once we take into account that arithmetic fact that actually, given the extent of the Conservative fall, the Conservative vote is undoubtedly going to fall more heavily in places that they're trying to defend than in the elsewhere. And we saw this in the two by-elections. The swing in the two by-elections was less than in the national polls. Once you bear that in mind, then actually, yes, given the current position, at least the immediate prospect, at least for the Conservatives in the general election, is perhaps even worse than the headline treatment of a 20-point lead might imply.